Good afternoon, Jim, and welcome to the Public Service Leadership Academy's Leadership Insight Series. The Leadership Insight Series is really intended to share experiences and expertise of senior executives with rising leaders in the public sector about important topics such as presidential transition, leading in times of crisis, and advice to leaders in government on the qualities and capabilities important when they're making hiring and promotion decisions. So today we have with us Jim Williams, who really needs no introduction, is very well known across government and industry. He's currently a partner in Williams and Schambach, but he has a long history in government service. So welcome, Jim, and thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you, Martha, and I'm proud to be associated with you, of course, and the Public Service Leadership Academy.
Yes, Jim is on our advisory board, and we appreciate the time that he gives us in the advisory board. And he's also a judge for the Service to the Citizen Award, so give that a little plug too. So he's everywhere. Jim, just to go back a little bit about your background, I know you've been at the Internal Revenue Service, DHS, and GSA, and you've worked with a lot of important programs across government, including US Visit and tax systems modernization and a GSA. You were both the commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service and our acting administrator prior to the Obama administration. So if we start at the beginning, what prompted you to join the government, and did I cover your background adequately, or is there some gap you need to fill?
There's no gap. I did also work for a few other agencies, Commerce, Education, FDIC is also way back. Um, uh, Getting a job in the federal government is kind of an interesting story. First of all, I graduated from college, and my father, a career naval officer, so public service was kind of in my blood. My parents were the greatest generation. My mother was a World War II nurse. My father said, "Get out of bed and get a job." So I looked in the Washington Post, and this is a true story. There's some job that looked great, but it was in this far out place called Warrenton, Virginia. So I drove out there one day and met two of the sleaziest individuals I'd ever met, who kept promising me a great job, make lots of money. And I said, "Look, I'm interested. What's the job?" And they kept talking about it. Finally, they told me it was selling door-to-door burial insurance.
Oh man.
Well, that day I got home and there was a call from a guy from Department of Commerce, said, "Would you like to come in for an interview to be a work in procurement and be a purchasing person?" And I didn't know what procurement meant. I later looked it up in the dictionary, and it had something to do with obtaining prostitutes is what procure meant. That sounds interesting. And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll come in next week." Well, I called the guy back. It was a Friday afternoon. I called him back that day, said, "I'm free now. Can I come in now?" He said, "I was about to call you back." And I started at Department of Commerce as a GS4. I'd been a GS3 before at FDIC, but I got into procurement. I loved it. It actually felt like I could use all of the things I took in undergraduate business school. And I really wanted to make a career out of government, which I did.
Yeah, I know you've had a long government career as I have, and when you talk to younger people about a government career, how do you explain, how do you convert that passion and the ability to have such an impact to people in terms of having a government career?
Well, Martha, you probably know I'm a shameless recruiter for government. I actually think I did recruit somebody once in an elevator. So I'll do it anywhere. When I talk to people about this, I speak from the heart, and I'm sure you do too.
Mhm.
I mean, the opportunity to make such an incredible difference. And if you believe, like I do, that America is the greatest country in the history of the world, and it's important, and what's important to our government and to our country is having good people in government, then I'm always trying to recruit the best in the government. And I tell the people, you're not going to get rich, working for government, but you will have such a rich set of experiences, and the pride you take that you can pass on, to, your kids, people, is just incredible. And I was lucky. Often say, if you're trying to recruit people into government, look what their parents did. If their parents were involved in some way in public service, you probably have a better chance of recruiting them. And I was fortunate. My father was a career naval officer, and as I said, my mother was a nurse, and just nicest person I ever met. But they really inspired me to work for government and continue it. And the kinds of things you get to do in government, especially at an early age.
Right.
I mean, when I was at GSA, early age as a GS-13, I was handling at one point in time what was called a $50 billion procurement. And I was a contracting officer on it. We later decided arbitrarily to cut that in half to 25 billion, but still, I was the top contracting person. You don't get that in the private sector. So I think the opportunity to serve the country, to make an impact, to feel good about your job. Um, and I often tell people who later in their career, I tell them, I say, look, once you've made enough money, go work for the government. You'll find two things. One, it's the hardest job you've ever had. And two, it'll be the thing in your career that you're the most proud of. And I believe that's true of anybody who comes into government.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of people that have never worked in the government, they may know that how much of a difference that you can make, but I don't think they actually realize how hard it can be sometimes to get things done. And maybe that's what adds to the beauty of it. I don't know that you get things done in spite of some of the rules that you have to live by. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a great feeling when you're actually a public servant. And right now the career public servants are have a lot to deal with in terms of they've been, most of them are working from home, although not everybody. And of course we've got a new administration transitioning into agencies, and everybody's really trying to embrace the changes and the new people coming in and understand what's going to happen to them. And you've worked through many administration changes. What advice do you have for people who are in those agencies and receiving those new politicals and building trust with them as they come in?
Well, I think whether you're working in the government or the private sector, change is constant, as we know now. And dealing with that change can be hard. I will say, working in the private sector now for many years, I tell everybody all my fantasies about work in the private sector have been destroyed by how hard I've had to work. And you do the same. We
Yeah.
were talking about that before. On the other hand, in the private sector, you don't have to deal with GAO and DIG and Congress and all these other stakeholders and different things other than just the bottom line that you have to deal with. And in terms of dealing with transition, I mean, a lot of times you find that the new incoming politicals come in with a perception that federal leaders are lazy, they're loyal to the opposite party. Um, you'll never get them to do what you want because they always have a hidden agenda. And I think it is, you're right. The word you used is trust. And one of the great public servants, a guy, Secretary of State George Shultz, who just died at age 100, and he was head of OMB, Secretary of State, and two other positions, I think Transportation and Labor, said, trust is the coin of the realm. And how you build that trust is really through the kind of person you are, the interactions you have, trying to overcome the misperceptions you have of the politicals who you think are only going to be there for 18 months. They're only there to quick build their resume and they don't trust you. Well, they have the same kind of misgivings about federal leaders. And the more you can do as a person to convince them, first of all, you work for them. You believe that the will of the people elected the president and therefore the president's team and those policies. And you're there to help make sure as you implement and execute on those policies, they're successful. And you hope that they will trust you. But that takes time. And I think, the number one thing you can do is be prepared for those political appointees to be able to, like we used to prepare the briefing books, the big books that handed to the new appointees so that they could get ready for their hearings, get ready to serve, as the Partnership for Public Service calls it, but really be ready to know your operation, open up, tell them everything, everything you can, no surprises, to help them be ready. And the more they think you're being open and honest with them, the more you can start to build that trust.
Yeah, I think just making them feel you're on their team, right? Like that we're one team, which is it's not always easy. I mean, you've worked for a lot of people that came and went, and didn't you find that almost everybody who came in having one perception of the federal workforce when they left, every single one of them in their speeches when they were leaving, right? Like I know what you know what I'm going to say. Every single one of them said, I had no idea at how hard the federal employees worked.
We used to call it the speech. It was, I was so surprised. I had no idea. I was so shocked at how dedicated, how smart, how wonderful federal employees are. And all you could think of was, well, you must have thought we were just horrible to
Right,
say that. But they're all, their eyes are open by how hardworking, dedicated, and smart federal
right.
leaders are. In my experience, when you get to the top of federal organizations, I've been in a few of them, there's not only incredibly smart, but incredibly well-educated people who it's, I always say, wait a minute, this is like the inverse of the pyramid, where the people at the top are the ones who are there working late at night, and the people lower down seem to be going home at regular hours. But you're right, we called that the speech, and you hope that they don't all come in with those misperceptions and feel like they have to make the speech, but it seems like so many of them do.
Well, I also, when I think back about my own career and thinking about people that came in and left, I mean, it as much as you try to develop that trust and as much as you really work towards it, not every political appointee that comes in is easy to work with. So, have you had any leadership challenges that you don't have to name names, but any leadership challenges that you faced, and what do people if they how do they overcome those if they're in that situation now?
That's a tough one. And I remember a person coming in and on their very first day, and that person was my direct report boss. And in a meeting, and I won't say the person was, but we were in a meeting with the commissioner of the IRS. And this person on their first day came in and asked myself and another person to do something we thought was unethical. And this was really our first interaction. And I just said, we don't do things that way. And said, well, that's the way it always works. And I said, well, we don't do things that way. Unfortunately, the commissioner, and I'll just say his name, Charles Rosati, I had the great fortune of working for absolutely incredible leaders. And Charles Rosati was one of them. I often say he was the smartest person I've ever been in the same room with. Said, hey, let's just move on. Maybe we can look at, doing something different next time, and put the person, off, and let us continue doing things in the right way. But it can be very tough. And, some people say it's not whether you speak up, it's how. And, sometimes you have to speak up, but you have to be careful in how you do it, because, they might be your boss. And you want to try and show them that you're supporting the end, which is get to, serving, meeting the mission, but doing it in the way you suggest and why that's to their benefit. And I used to have to do that quite a bit in procurement. I didn't want to be the contracting officer who always said no. I wanted to say yes, but here's how we can get that done. And it's a tough thing to do, and it's a tough thing to master. One of the things I always think, as a leader, which I don't think I was good at, because my kids would tell me I was needed to improve, and I'm sure occasionally your daughter might said the same thing to you. You need to listen to me. You need to be a better listener. And I think it is still a lifetime of learning for me to be a better listener, both with my ears and my eyes, so that I can respond as well as I can and still, speak up when I should.
Well, I think that the issue that you brought up about ethics is really an important one to dig in just a little bit with, and it's actually something that I think is a lesson learned on both the political side and on the career side. Because as a political appointee, sometimes they come into an agency and the way you do things in the private sector that seems totally legitimate way of doing things you can't do in in the government because of some law or regulation that they don't know about. I mean, even things about spending money before you actually have the authority to spend it and anti-deficiency, unless you really know what's going on behind the scenes, some of those things you can get yourself into without really realizing that you're doing anything wrong. So I would say, as a political appointee, having somebody around you that you can trust is going to keep you out of trouble will help you stay out of trouble, right? And then
Right.
on the career side, just don't let people talk you into doing things that are not that are not ethical, because you will pay in the end. And so it's a good balance to keep each other um, you know, moving towards the same common vision, but in a way that keeps everybody out of trouble.
I think you're right, Martha, and I think it's also important to always remember it's not our money. It's the taxpayer, the American people's money, and the perceptions of how we spend that money. You know, GSA had the Las Vegas conference scandal, and there's nothing wrong with Las Vegas. Great place to hold conferences. What they did was totally wrong with taxpayer money. And that might have been perfectly acceptable in the private sector. It was not acceptable to do that kind of thing with taxpayer money. And, people often talk about, the Washington Post test.
I was just going to mention that.
Well, which it hit, and I've unfortunately had the experience of being on in the Washington Post, even above the fold, as they say, a few times. But you really always want to do things that are the right thing to do and appear to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, that whole thing about sometimes it's not like legally wrong, but the perception of it is not something that you want to see printed across the newspaper. So I think those are really important things to kind of to bring out. And as like rising leaders in the government, or even senior leaders in the government, what do you, when you think of like the qualities of a good leader, what do you think of? I mean, you mentioned Charles Rosati. You've worked for a lot of really good well-known leaders. What are those qualities?
Well, I've been so fortunate. I mentioned Charles Rosati, but also Tom Ridge, Michael Chertoff, Admiral Jim Loy. I mean, and a woman who I worked for many, many years ago, early in my career, nobody would have ever heard of, but she was just remarkable. What I think I look for in leaders are people who care more about the mission and their people than they do about themselves. I'm looking for smart people. I'm always thinking about somebody who, uh, that the old phrase is, I'd rather have a horse I have to rein in than one I have to prod. You want somebody who's kind of a self-starter, who will do things on their own. I made some mistakes in hiring, as we all do. Sometimes you look for people who are loyal or maybe even too much like you. And one of the things I tell young people sometimes at the Partnership for Public Service, when you're going to promote or give an assignment or do hiring or training, something I used to call PATH, to people, always think about, am I applying a filter to this? Because I tell them the story at the IRS. We promoted a woman to a GS-15 position. At the time, she was 64 years old. She was absolutely floored that we promoted her. She goes, I never thought you'd give me this promotion. She was fantastic. And everybody was shocked that we did it. Well, we thought she was great. And she said nobody would promote me because they thought I was too old. And she probably worked 5 more years. She was fantastic. But I think we all have filters. And if you're thinking about the leaders you want, think in those terms. If you have a filter, I would say I don't care much for Yankee fans, because I'm a baseball person. But I try to put that aside. But you try to look for the person who is a has all those leadership qualities that you want, that they can, analyze a problem. And I tell young people, these kind of characteristics, you want to be able to have good analytical skills, good oral and written communication skills, and then you want people who know how to lead. And in my first job as a supervisor, I was terrible at delegating because I thought I knew how to do it best. And finally somebody approached me and said, you know, you're kind of giving us all the grunt work. And I thought, wow, they're absolutely right. And so also caring about management excellence, I think is very important. We always cared about what kind of space our people had, caring about the day-to-day lives of the people who work for you is very important.
Well, I think, I worked at GSA when you worked at GSA, and you were always known as, a leader who took really good care of the people that worked for him. And I think, that is the trait of a good leader, is creating an environment where they can be the best that they can be, right? And they feel like they're given things and tasks that allow them to grow along the way too, because it is hard sometimes as you're moving up the chain or you're getting people in your organization to figure out exactly how do I use each person and get the strengths that they have out the best way I can. So I think those are all.
Well, late in my career, somebody said, "What's your management philosophy?" And I thought, well, I don't have one. But then I thought about it. I said, my philosophy is people and results in that order. If you get the right people, give them the right training, the right tools, the right metrics, the right direction, get out of their way, and they'll perform the results every time. And just a couple of examples. When I came to GSA as the first commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service, first of all, I was shocked that people weren't allowed to speak in public. And I said, look, you're senior executives. I don't want to be the only person speaking. I want you out there. And there were people you and I know, like Mary Davy and others, who said, "Good, we want to be there," and they did, and they were great at promoting GSA, the mission. They were, top-notch people who you trusted to speak. Another thing I'll say, and maybe I shouldn't, but when of my closest direct reports, I think I might have had 7 of them, all senior executives. 2 of them were women in some of the most senior positions, and you know who they are. And they were the lowest paid of the 7. And I said, "What is this?" And they said, "Well, they have the least seniority." I said, "So what? They have some of the biggest responsibilities." And I set upon myself to rectify that, because you do want an organization that is open to people. And when I was at DHS, I didn't realize this. I just tried to bring in good people. But somebody came in and told me, said, "Jim, everybody in the gay community thinks you're great." I said, "What for? Who's in the gay community?" I didn't even know. I said, "Well, you're promoting gays to senior positions." I said, "Okay, well, one of them I didn't even know was gay." But there was another organization in DHS, I won't say where, but people who were gay knew you didn't work there. You weren't really tolerated. And I've always thought, well, too bad for them. You create the most inclusive organization you can, means you're going to attract the best talent. And I believe, like others have said, you can get a very homogenous group together and get to a B plus. But if you can get a very diverse group of people, and diversity means a lot of different things, including Yankee fans, but getting a lot of different people together, get them to focus on the mission. And I always believe, never talk about yourself, talk about the mission. And if you can get them to work together as a team for the mission, that's when you get to an A plus.
Yeah, and diversity and inclusion is such an important topic. It has been, and it's even a bigger topic today. And I know, in one of the organizations I had, it was more on people who just thought differently, right? I wanted everybody to get along, but one thought you should have, like, the top security, and the other group thought you could do things without all this security. It was overkill. And so I used to want everybody to just, be kumbaya and get along. And it turned out that by getting them together and making them come to an agreement, you get the better solution to meet the mission of the agency. And that goes for the same thing around, race, sexual orientation, and and all these other topics that fall into the diversity area. So I'm glad you brought that up. You've the organizations and agencies that you've worked with, GSA, DHS, IRS, there's always something popping in the news or some hurricane or some, emergency going on. And at GSA, I felt like we were involved in every emergency, right? I know in the citizen services area, we were more involved than people knew, but in the FAS area, you were also involved. And then of course, running all of GSA, you got involved. How do you, if there is a crisis, do you have any like roadmap or game plan that you execute on when going through that?
Well, I think when you're going through a crisis, first and foremost, care about the victims. And you can see, and we've seen people who haven't done that. The head of British Petroleum, when they had the oil spill, said, "I just want my life back." Well, so do all the people down there in the Gulf whose careers and lives were ruined by what your company did. So don't speak about yourself ever. I also think even though you're going through a crisis, you often have to think about a process by which you are going to make decisions in a timely way. But you also have to, if you can, be inclusive in trying to make those decisions. You have to quickly listen to the best inputs on people. One of the things a friend of mine did over at DHS when they were going through Katrina, he was the head of procurement. He called the IG and said, "You're going to be looking at me after this quite a bit and what I do. I want you side by side with me right now," and
Mhm.
kind of made them somewhat of a close by partner. I think, in any crisis, again, think about, even though you want to act fast, what are the process steps you're taking that leads you to that decision? It I'm not trying to say cover yourself. It will be looked at, but it also leads to better decision making. I think the other thing about any crisis, any change, is absolutely communication. You just can't communicate enough. Give people credit, even if you don't have anything to tell them you don't have anything to tell them. The more you can communicate, the better. And I think that's something that is crisis management 101 is communicate, communicate, communicate. Um, and care about the victims. Do everything you can to streamline things to get people the help they need.
Yeah, right now they just came out with the preliminary results. You may have seen it from the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey for this year. And the government got some really good scores. I think it was like 65% of all people said that they felt their leaders really communicated with them during this COVID time. And about the same percentage that they felt like their agencies were cared about their health and safety, which says a lot for people because I agree with you, communicating, especially during an emergency, even if it's, a snowstorm or back at 9/11, we were both in the government during that time and people didn't know what to do or we didn't have the technology capabilities we do today to keep people informed, but um it
I'll
is
tell you
it's
a
important.
story about that. We had a lot of people work for me out in New Carrollton, which had about 4,000 people in that building. And if you remember, communications were down. And finally, a woman got through to me who worked for me, a senior executive, on my cell phone. She said, "Jim, nobody's telling us what to do. Our people want to go home to their families." And I said, "Tell them from me, they can go home." I had no authority to do that whatsoever.
Right.
But I just said, people wanted to take care of their children. If you remember that day, it was a chilling day.
I
And
do.
I said, tell them they can go home. And I thought, you know what? I don't care. I'll take the consequences later. And apparently the word spread and people left. and nobody blamed him. Nobody got in trouble, but
Yeah.
it was the right thing to do.
Well, your point about the IG is really important too, because in the heat of the moment, decisions have to be made and things have to be done. You know, when when I was at GSA, we were putting contact centers in place for some of the the hurricanes like Katrina, Wilma, Rita, and sometimes decisions need to be made, and you got to make sure that you're dotting the i's and crossing the t's the best you can, and then know that there will be people will be looking at all these decisions later on. So it's almost like, I don't know if you have any advice. I'm thinking of all the drills that we ran, and just really kind of knowing what you're going to do as an agency or an organization or a leader, to have in your mind exactly what am I going to do in times of emergency, and having things ready, with, all the rosters that you have to call people. And, it's just, it's something that you need to think about and be prepared for, just like you do in your personal life.
Right. I agree with you. You've got to be prepared and you've got to practice. I mean, that's why in Homeland Security, they do the top off exercises and
Yep.
things like that.
Yep.
You've got to do those. And I think also knowing, as you said, who to call, how to make those connections. And if you don't already have those connections, you better get them now so that you can be ready when the time comes.
Well, we're in these times of where both teleworking and remote working, right? You've got people working from everywhere, and some I've heard, you've got the FEVS data, which says people are communicating, but then you've got other people talking about, I feel disconnected as a team, or I feel disconnected from my leadership. Or how do you think managers, leaders in organizations can, because we may not go back to the same kind of working environment. In fact, I'm sure there will be lots of or there probably is a lot of analysis going on right now about how much money is saved for people personally, as well as the government and a public buildings footprint and all that, and looking at plans going forward. How can we kind of lead our teams going forward without people? I mean, I think we're all in Zoom fatigue at this point. So, full time being at home may not be the answer, but any advice?
Well, first of all, you talked about how the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey said that their leaders did a good job. I would say so far. This, what we're in right now, the pandemic, this has a ways to go in terms of people coming back in the office. As you
Right.
say, a lot of people may never go back in the office. And even if they do, how do you manage a blended workforce? How do you have meetings where some people are not in the room, some people are? First of all, I think we need the technology. I think we need the training because our manager is only going to promote those people who actually come into the office and not, care about those people who don't come into the office. I think, how do you manage? How do you really do the job you're supposed to be doing, which is managing based upon results? And how do you also get to collaboration? And how do you connect with people? It's not easy, but right now what we have is the Zoom, the Skype, the WebEx, the Teams, all those different things that we're on all the time. And I think scheduling times to just do it, maybe you say, okay, with my employees or my direct reports, I want to do 15 minutes every 2 weeks. I don't want to burden you too much, but I do want to connect with you both one-on-one and as a group. I think you're going to need both. I think that communication that you talked about, who knows how we're going to even manage all this going back. People in the intelligence community said nobody can telework. Well, then they found out they can,
Right.
and they do sometimes the blue and gold in 1 week, out the next. At IRS, I think before the pandemic, it was like 1% telework. Today, it's 97% at this moment. GSA was a leader in this, but most agencies were not, and they're ill prepared from both the technology, managers knowing how to manage, managers knowing how to connect and guide the career development of people who are going to have to take your place. I mean, I think that's very important. And I think the training that we need to give is going to be different because there are organizations that have worked in this manner for many years. On a call the other day, the guy from PTO, Patent and Trademark Office, said, we've been remote for a long time.
Right.
It works well. And productivity went up. I think we're going to have to be measuring things before and after the pandemic and all that kinds of things, but really pay attention to the managers. How do we help them, giving them the right technology, the right tools, and the right best practices on how best to connect and guide employees. Think about that employee coming out of college. I was on Zoom yesterday with one. I don't think she's ever reported to an office, and she's out of college. What a strange, strange feeling that is. And as I remember what young people said at GSA, we want high tech and high touch. They want to use things like this, but they want to be able to connect to leaders because they still believe there are things they can learn from us old folks.
Yeah, you know, I agree with you on we still have a long way to go down this path because productivity has seemed to be pretty high so far, but we've all been stuck at home. And so what happens when things do open up and people have the ability to, you know, work from anywhere, but they also have the ability to go out of their house. So I think people, at least managers, maybe even have, you know, that they're going back to back meetings and Zooms all day long, and people are on camera. And so when do you get your work done? So how do you balance being able to set aside time to connect versus time to get work done? And maybe that goes back to what you were talking about in terms of measuring for results as opposed to measuring for, you know, making sure it's like making sure you can see somebody in your seat as opposed to actually the results of the work that they're doing. So we do have a
Well,
lot of learning.
I would add, when we were all together and we were in meetings together, we saw people together, we were interacting more as human beings. The kind of thing you and I were used to throughout our career. How do you retain that human touch? I'm not sure. I know people have come up with some fun things to do as kind of
Right.
like ice breaking things, and you got to be careful of those things because people on Zoom so much. So is this another thing I have to sit through? But I think we do need to find creative ways to keep ourselves as humans together.
Well, maybe when this is over, there's a way to bring everybody in the office together, you know, once a month or every 2 weeks or some way so that there is a time where people can kind of get to know each other and at least see each other. I was talking to a friend of mine at GSA the other day, and she was calling it, you know, the water cooler chatter. Like there is no water cooler chatter. So you can't, if you're going to talk to somebody, you know, it's an effort every time you want to connect with somebody to be able to you know, you don't just run into people. Of course, on if you're on certain platforms, you can just chat them up and see if you can get something, but it's still a little bit different.
Right.
Um, I wanted to get into just a couple more things, but one, if you're talking to mid-level managers who want to be senior executives, what kind of advice do you give them about like thinking um, about about rising to those senior levels in government?
Well, I've always, when I'm looking at people to promote into management, I kind of like people who really are dedicated to their profession and people who, when they can, have furthered their education. And I know some people can't because they've got a family to take care of, but you can tell the people who really care about what they do. I would say continue to learn, read. Yeah, I like to read a lot. I actually, with my twin brother, I run a men's book club. We're actually called the Dopes, but that's our we read at least a book a month. Um, and I think, being somebody who can absorb how to continually look at yourself to be a better leader. As I said, the listening skills, the communication skills, the analytical skills. How do you get people together to solve a problem? And, how do you treat people? My parents taught me the golden rule. I was in a meeting not too long ago with a person we know, Jeff Kosis. And I was just astounded. Jeff, I think, is a fantastic leader, but he went around the room and while on, this kind of a call and asked every single person what they thought. And, so many people are reluctant to speak up because they're more introverted, but he allowed everybody to express an opinion. And you've seen a lot of leaders who won't do that. They'll listen to a few and then tell you what you're going to do. And he really had a great way about him of including people. And I think thinking about yourself as a leader, and it's not to be well liked. That's not what you're trying to do. You want to be, I guess, respected. And, you also want to be somebody, as I always tell young people, when they get to be a leader and there's somebody who's a poison in the atmosphere, don't be shy about going after them and either helping them move or get rid of them. And, that means you're caring about the people and you're sending the right signal for the kind of, how we treat each other. And you may not remember this, but when I was named Acting Administrator of GSA, the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey came out and GSA was usually in the top 10. And I said, well, that's great. I want to be number one. I'm a bit competitive. But I said, it's not about me. I think what number one means, it starts with each of us. And how do we treat each other every day? How do we care about, everybody, when we used to have people in a copy room, how do you care about those people and everybody part of the team, and treat everybody well, as my father and mother always taught me. And I think if you can get a leader to do that, then people bond more to that leader and more to each other. And I've always said, as a leader, you wear two hats, the organization you manage and a teamwork hat. Because I've seen people who are very, very strong leaders and terrible team players.
Mhm. Great advice. So I just want to ask, is there anything that you'd like to talk about in terms of leadership or leading in times of crisis or presidential transitions, or that you that we didn't address, or anything outside of that?
No, I guess if you're really talking about young people and leadership, like I said, if you can continue your education in some way, make sure you have good analytical skills. You're the master of your craft, good oral communication skills, written communication skills. I think also, some of the merit principles, work hard. The government says you give an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. I like to work hard. I mean, I'm a pretty boring person. I always say I'm kind of like Napoleon Dynamite. I don't have any other cool manly skills. I
Except
like
in baseball season.
well, I love baseball. But speaking of baseball, Davey Martinez said, let's work hard, let's get along, and let's go 1-0 every day. Start every day. It's a new day. I also say something bad will happen to you in your career. Totally unfair. You don't deserve it. Something bad will happen. It's all about how you react. Also, be somebody that people want to be around. I think that makes a difference. So I always want to be somebody that somebody would want to join my team. That kind
Yeah,
of thing.
I couldn't agree with you more on those, last 2 points about it's not when or if it's going to happen to you, it's when it happens to you. And many times it's no fault of your own
Yep.
when it happens. And so how you react to it or not overreact to it is a big indicator of you as a leader and the confidence that you have. And so I agree with that. And I agree with the want to be around. I mean, you can't underestimate I know I've had people that I worked with that they were smart, they were hardworking, but you just couldn't stand to be around them. So, you know,
Can I tell you one other thing? I think as a leader is be genuine, and all leadership. In fact, Tom Ridge said this once. All leadership is personal, and I always tell the story of real quick. I know I tell a lot of stories.
that's good.
My wife's first cousin's husband. My wife's first cousin is graduate Naval Academy. She married the quarterback from the Naval Academy. And he was always worried in his career he'd always be perceived as the quarterback and never really advance in the Navy. Well, he's an admiral now, but before he was an admiral, he was the XO, the executive officer on a ship. And he decided, you know what, I'm not going to hide away from my sports background. So every morning he would gather all of his officers and senior enlistment on the back of the ship and say, huddle up. And they would go into a huddle. And he said, let's talk about what we're going to accomplish today. And then when they're finished, they'd yell, break. And one day he didn't do it. And they all said, hey, Commander, we didn't huddle. We didn't huddle. We didn't do this. And again, he made it genuine and personal because it's who he is. And he's his name happens to be Admiral Bill Byrne. He's a great guy. And you know, he made it personal, but also made it about the team.
Yep. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time today. And we need that book, you know, your book recommendations since you're reading so many books. So maybe that's something you can share with us.
Well, I just started one, and I'm. It's not a book club one we're reading right now, but it's called something like The Book About Eels. And none of the guys wanted to read a book about eels, but it's interesting. In the first few pages, eels go through very, very different transformations in their lives. And if you pick up the book anywhere, read the first 5 pages, and it's just fascinating. And I know all these guys say, we're not going to read about those slithery creatures, but it's kind of it's a good book so far. But the book we're reading right now is Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose about Lewis and Clark.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree with you. Lifelong learning is a great thing to put in to strive for. So
Right.
thank you again, Jim. And I'm sure we will see each other again soon in another forum, but appreciate you taking some time to share your insights into leadership with us.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Martha. Anytime.
Thanks.
Bye.